Okay, till now you got to know that people are going back to their hometown via ship, and there you two characters meet in a compartment, one black and other white. The narrator is the white person here. So and Mr. Kellada is black, and everybody criticizes or mock Kellada for interfering in others' work and being too argumentative. Because of this character of his, he is termed as Mr. Know-all. So in the previous page, we discussed that as the conversation continues, the conversation somehow moves on to the topic of Pearl. There, he discusses, Mr. Kellada reveals that he is an expert in the Pearl business, and by just looking at it, he can say whether it is a original one or a duplicate one. And Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey were away from each other for almost an year because of the war scenario. They have a discussion related to these pearls. So Mrs. Ramsey has an illegal affair with extramarital affair with the other person. The other person would have gifted Mrs. Ramsey this pearl necklace. But Mrs. Ramsey would have told Mr. Ramsey that this is a duplicate one. And she just got it in some local shop. Then as the conversation proceeds, Mr. Ramsey asks Kellada to verify the genuineness of this of the pearl necklace of Mrs. Ramsey, and requests to inform him regarding what could be its cost. Then, so the conversation proceeds. I noticed it at once, answered Mr. Kellada. Gee, I said to myself, those are pearls, all right. I didn't buy it myself, of course. I'd be interested to know how much you think it cost. So this is the conversation of Mr. Ramsey. Oh, in the trade somewhere around $15,000. But if it was bought on Fifth Avenue, I shouldn't be surprised to hear that anything up to 30,000 was paid for it. So he says, just like how we buy products in the showroom or in the local marketplace, how the price varies. Similarly, he says the price also varies. Ramsey smiled grimly. You will be surprised to hear that Mrs. Ramsey bought that string at a department store the day before we left New York for $18. Can you believe this? 18. Where is $18 and where is $15,000? So from here you get to know that Mrs. Ramsey has lied Mr. Ramsey that it is some dummy piece, dummy pearl set. But originally it will minimum cost 15,000 rupees. So the one pearl necklace that she was wearing was an original one gifted to her by her lover, whom she had through an extramarital relationship. But she does not reveal that to her husband. So now what Mr. Kellada does? Because Mr. Kellada is an expert in the field of pearl business, by just looking at the pearl, he can say. That's why he says Mr. Kellada flushed, means he starts laughing. Rod, it's not only real, but it's a fine and string for its size as I've ever seen. So now Mr. Kellada is unaware of Mrs. Ramsey's relationship. Okay, therefore he tries to tell the truth. See, this is a real one, original one, and you look at the size. You can't get it for $18. Will you bet on it? I will bet you $100. It's imitation. Done. So these are the words said by Mr. Ramsey. Mr. Ramsey says, okay, let's have a bet. I will bet you that it's a duplicate one, imitation. You may have come across imitation jewelry. Okay, in India we call it as Uma gold or rolled gold when it comes to gold. So other ornament, we call it as imitation. Oh, Elmer, you can't bet on certainty, said Mrs. Ramsey. She had a little smile on her lips and her tone was gently deprecating. So here one can feel that Mrs. Ramsey is feeling tensed. She is afraid that her relationship will be revealed to her husband. Can't I? If I get a chance of easy money like that, I should be all sorts of a fool not to take it. But how can it be proved? She continued. It's only my word against Mr. Kellada's. Let me look at the chain, and if it's imitation, I will tell you quickly enough. I can afford to lose $100, said Mr. Kellada. So Mr. Kellada is very confident. Mrs. Ramsey questions him. How can you prove that it is imitation, that it is original one and not imitation? Then Mr. Kellada says, it's all based on my experience. By just looking at it, I can tell it. Take it off, dear. Let the gentleman look at it as much as he wants. These words are said by Mr. Ramsey. Mrs. Ramsey hesitated a moment. She put her hands to the clasp. I can't undo it, she said. Mr. Kellada will just have to take my word for it. So even now, when Mr. Ramsey suggests Mr. Ramsey to take out the necklace, she is hesitant. Okay, she refuses to show the necklace to Mr. Kellada. Therefore, she says, I can't undo it, means I can't remove it. She just says, just listen to me, just believe my words. Had a sudden suspicion that something unfortunate was about to occur, but he could not think of nothing to say. Ramsay jumped up, I will do it. So here, these are the words of the narrator who is viewing this. This is described in first person. So then he says the narrator feels there is something fishy because Mrs. Ramsay is hesitant to reveal or to give her the pearl necklace. He handed the chain to Mr. Kalada. So since Mrs. Ramsay was hesitant, Ramsay only undid it, removed it. He handed the chain to Mr. Kalada. The Levantine took a magnifying glass from his pocket and closely examined it. Whom do you call it as a Levantine here? It's Mr. Kalada. A smile of triumph spread over his smooth and swarthy face. So when he looked at it from the magnifying glass, Mr. Kalada was sure that it is the original one. Okay, it will minimum cost $15,000 and not an imitation, which just cost $18. He handed back the chain. He was about to speak. See, this is very much important. This para is very much important. He was about to speak. Suddenly, he caught sight of Mrs. Ramsay's face. It was so wide that she looked as though she were about to faint. She was staring at him with wide and terrified eyes. They held a desperate appeal. It was so clear that I wondered why her husband did not see it. So, when he was about to tell the truth, when Mr. Kalada was about to tell the truth that it is a real one, he looked at Mrs. Ramsay's face. She had a very sorry face there. Okay, she was very much tensed. Looking at her face, he decides to change his mind. So what does he say? Mr. Kalada stopped with his mouth open. He flushed deeply. You could almost see the effort he was making over himself. So Mr. Kalada felt there is something fishy between Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, and Mrs. Ramsay is hiding the truth. Therefore, in order to save Mrs. Ramsay, Kalada says this. I was mistaken, he said. It's a very good imitation. But of course, as soon as I looked through my glass, I saw that it wasn't real. Though it was real, in order to save Mrs. Ramsay from the marriage or Mrs. Ramsay's marriage with Mr. Ramsay, he lies. Though the pearl is real, he says that it is not real. I think $18 is just about as much as a damn thing's worth. So you should be very much aware of it. The $18 is what Mrs. Ramsay says. Originally, it cost $15,000 to $30,000. It's not rupees. He took out his pocketbook and from it a $100 bill. He handed it to Ramsay without a word. So, more than saving Mrs. Ramsay, he also lost his reputation in front of everybody. Okay, everybody mocked at him, calling him as Mr. Know-all, and he sacrificed his self-respect in order to save the respect of Mrs. Ramsay. This incident makes the narrator, who is a white person, to change his perception towards black. Perhaps that will teach you not to be so cocksure another time, my young friend, said Ramsay as he took the note. So he's mocking at him. Mr. Ramsay is mocking at him. So from henceforth, don't be so overconfident. He suggests, I noticed that Mr. Kalada's hands were trembling. The story spread over the ship as stories do, and he had to put up with a good deal of chaff that evening. It was a fine joke that Mr. Know-all had been caught out, but Mrs. Ramsay retired to her storeroom with a headache. So everybody started making fun of Mr. Kalada, saying that henceforth, you should not be so much overconfident. He learned a very good lesson, and everybody started mocking at Mr. Kalada in the ship. And Mrs. Ramsay retired to the room, citing that she is suffering from headache. Next morning, I got up and began to shave. That is, I see whenever you come across I, in most of the cases, it is narrator. Narrator is watching the story, watching the scene, and he is narrating it. Mr. Kalada lay on his bed smoking a cigarette. Suddenly, there was a small scraping sound, and I saw a letter pushed under the door. Okay, in next day morning, this narrator and Mr. Kalada are inside the compartment, and somebody pushes an envelope inside their room. I opened the door and looked out. There was nobody there. I picked up the letter and saw that it was addressed to Max Kalada. So the full name of Kalada is Max Kalada. The name was written in block letters. I handed it to him. Who's this from? He opened it. Oh, he took out of the envelope not a letter, but a $100 bill. So you should remember the previous day, Mr. Kalada, since he lost the bet with Mr. Ramsay, he had given a $100 note. The next day morning, hopefully, it is Mrs. Ramsay. In order to reduce her guilt, she writes a letter to Mr. Kalada and also hands over a $100 bill. He looked at me and again he reddened. He tore the envelope with little bits and gave them to me. So this Mr. Kelada was very much frustrated. Though Mrs. Ramsey apologized in the letter, he felt really humiliated the previous night because everybody started making fun of him. Okay, so he just took out the letter, $100 note, and tore the envelope and the letter. Do you mind just throwing them out of the porthole? I did as he asked and then looked at him with a smile. No one likes being made look like a perfect damn fool, he said. Were the pearls real? So these are the words said by Mr. Kelada. No one likes being made to look a perfect damn fool. So though he was made a fool in front of everybody, he refrained from speaking the truth in order to save Mrs. Ramsey. Then he questions, were the pearls real? Who questions this? Narrator questions this. Were the pearls real? Then, so he does not answer properly. He says, no one likes being, he says, if I had a pretty little wife, I shouldn't let her spend a year in New York while I stayed at Kobe, said he. So indirectly he hints, says that one of the lovers of Mrs. Ramsey had gifted this to Mrs. Ramsey. That's why he says, when the narrator asks the question, were the pearls real? Then Mr. Kelada says, if I had a pretty little wife, I wouldn't leave her alone for 1 year while I stayed at Kobe. At that moment, I did not entirely dislike Mr. Kelada. He reached out for his pocketbook and carefully put it in it a $100 note. At that moment, I did not entirely dislike Mr. Kelada. So he says, throughout his stay with Max Kelada, the narrator, the white narrator, was very much disappointed, was very much uncomfortable. But after this incident, he stopped disliking him. So did not entirely dislike Kelada. You remove the negatives here. Did not dis. I entirely liked Kelada. He reached out for his pocketbook and carefully put in it the $100 note. He just inserted $100 note in his purse. Okay, so throughout the story, Max Kelada was criticized, first of all, for being black, mocked at for being black, and for being talkative. Everybody called him as Mr. Know-all. And because of this Pearl incident, he sacrificed his own self-respect in order to save the honor of a woman. If he had revealed the truth, it could have even eventually led to divorce between Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, and there could have been a lot of familial issues. But in order to save this woman, Mrs. Ramsey, from experiencing any discomfort, what did he do? He portrayed himself as a fool. He said his assumption is only wrong. Okay, he even lost $100 note. So Mrs. Ramsey, having some consciousness, she returns the $100 and even apologizes to him over a letter. However, what all is written in the letter is not revealed. It is just our guesswork that she would have apologized. And this moment, when the white narrator gets to know that Mr. Kelada has sacrificed his own self-respect to save the honor of a woman, respect of a woman, his prejudices against black gets diminished or disappears. Okay, with this you can get to know what you should understand, that is, you should not judge a book by its cover. You should go through the book. Similarly, you should not judge people based on their appearance. You should understand